Well, there I'm Brian Taylor. Very warm welcome to the latest edition of my Herald podcast. Now, quite a week of contrasts, really. I mean, dare we begin to believe that the very worst of COVID may be behind us, or must we continue to be cautious? And from that novel, if now hideously familiar problem, to a crisis that has frankly been with us for decades, the appalling number of drugs-related deaths in Scotland. New figures due out tomorrow, but nobody feeling particularly optimistic given the record of recent years. So what can we all collectively do? Now, to discuss those topics and anything else that arises, I'm delighted to welcome my panel from the Herald, Alistair Grant; from the Liberal Democrats, the DMOB happy Willie Rennie, about to stand down as leader; from the Conservatives, MSP Murdo Fraser; from the Greens, Gillian Mackay, Central Scotland MSP; and from the SNP MP, Kirsten Oswald. A warm welcome to you all. Just before we start, Willie, what's happening? I think Alex Cole-Hamilton is standing to replace you, and are you looking forward to your different role?
Yes, I am. What's happening just now is the gymnastics are on the Olympics, so you're distracting me from my obsession with the Olympics. But no, I think Alex has got off to a good start. He had a good launch yesterday, and it's a long nomination process, but by the time we come back in September, we should
possibly a short election process. We shall see. No, we'll let you get back to your jumping box or rings or whatever it is you were exercising with in the previous moment. Let's talk about coronavirus. Nicola Sturgeon this week, First Minister, saying grounds for optimism because of the figures, but of course the big caveat. The need to be cautious. What do you make of that, Willie Rennie? Where are we, do you think, on coronavirus? What's your take?
I think the numbers are looking much better, and I think we will see a further easing of restrictions next week. But the easing was always going to be much more difficult than the imposition.
Interesting.
And getting things to move in sync is going to be difficult. I mean, this morning I was speaking to businesses who were facing massive problems with recruitment and the cost of staff, which is going up. But secondly, accessing materials, construction, manufacturing, and so on, but also the cost of that going up. And that's going to be a problem. I think it's going to be here for the next 2, 3, 4 years. And it's not just a consequence of Brexit, but also the pandemic. But it's going to be quite difficult to deal with those issues alone, let alone all the other parts of the easing.
Alistair Grant, but bring us up to speed. Where are we next? I mean, Willie Rennie's mentioning there's a further stage. We're expecting some out. Take us through what's coming next in terms of announcements from the Scottish Government.
Yes, also, I mean, you touched on it just there in terms of Nicola Sturgeon's announcement on Tuesday, or her briefing on Tuesday, where she was quite optimistic. I thought there was quite a lot of optimism in terms of the figures. I think just in terms of the promising statistics, there was case numbers more than halving in the last 3 weeks, hospital admissions falling. So Nicola Sturgeon said that essentially next week, and I think an update to the Scottish Parliament, she'll set out, in her words, whether and to what extent that August 9th date for removing most of the coronavirus restrictions can take place. I think that's interesting phrasing, because it suggests that it's not a binary decision in the sense of, removing all of those coronavirus restrictions. There could be some that remain, perhaps around wearing masks, or maybe some restrictions in indoor places, those kind of thorny issues that remain. So that'll be the kind of next major update on Tuesday next week.
Okay. Willie Rennie's raised let's go with the economy first, and then come back to the business of vaccination. Murdo Fraser, it's always been the case that coronavirus was a health challenge and an economic challenge. Is it now the case that it's always been a problem, but we're beginning to see the extent of that economic challenge as well? What do you make?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really mixed picture out there. And I was in meetings earlier this week with people from the financial services community, which has performed extremely well throughout COVID and has really seen very little negative impact. Other parts of the economy, events and tourism, have been very majorly affected. And I mean, the point Willie made a moment ago, I thought was an important one. Actually, what we're seeing in sectors of the economy are substantial skill shortages now. And you can hardly walk down a high street now without seeing in shop windows signs saying staff wanted in retail, in home delivery, in hospitality. That's not helped by people getting pinged, as we know, and having to stay at home. But there's a broader issue, and I think there's a debate around the furlough scheme. There's still a lot of people on furlough That is
figures today on that, Mardo, from the Treasury. Still 135,000 have left the scheme in Scotland, and they say that should be welcome news. But 141,500 still on it, and the scheme tightens from Sunday and is removed altogether from September. Your critics of the Conservative approach would say that that's a cliff edge that's going to damage a lot of people's prospects.
Well, the furlough scheme is winding down, although in the past the Chancellor has been swift to move to extend it where that's required, and it may need a sectoral approach to it rather than a blanket approach. But there's clearly a mismatch going on in the economy if there are people still furloughed and effectively being paid by the taxpayer, and at the same time there are lots of vacancies because the economy has shifted over COVID, and a lot of new jobs have been created that didn't exist before.
Are you saying
example of that is home delivery services have expanded massively over the past 12 months. These jobs are probably going to stay, whereas there are jobs perhaps that existed in retail. We've seen a lot of big retailers disappear over the past year. These jobs
forgive me briefly before I bring in Kirsten Oswald on this. Are you saying to the Chancellor that he should consider perhaps extending the furlough for, say, the hospitality sector or other sectors that have been struggling?
Well, I certainly think that's something you'll look at. And I mean, one sector to look at, for example, has been events, which have been very seriously curtailed over the past year and is slow to come back. And I think that's a sector where the Chancellor could look at saying, is there a need for some longer-term sectoral support for those working in that sector? But let's not forget, a lot of new jobs have been created, and we need to make sure people are filling these jobs.
Kirsten Oswald, what do you make of the economic situation? First of all, we'll come back to the health business in a minute, and I'll bring in Gillian in a second. What do you make, Kirsten?
I think it is really a complex picture, and I think that really ties into what Alistair said about the nuance and what the First Minister said in her briefing the other day, because none of this is straightforward. It's not been straightforward at any point during the last 18 months, and this economic perspective is no more straightforward now than it has been. I think for me, I think there are particular concerns around the end of furlough. I think that is a big issue. I'm fascinated to hear what Murdo's saying, because I think that there is a need to look at sectoral specific measures, and I think that if the Chancellor is going to do that, he needs to get a bit of a wiggle on and do it now, because there are so many jobs that are dependent upon this, and the situation for different sectors of the economy is so widely varied. I think that the other concern that I have in sort of economic terms is the move to pull the universal credit uplift as well, because in terms of people's own personal economic situations, which obviously feeds into the wider economy too, that happening at the same time as this furlough removal, I think is going to cause a real challenge for a number of households all over Scotland, and that is going to cause a challenge for some of the.
But do you accept the argument the Chancellor would make that you cannot sustain furlough and enhanced benefits forever? At some point, you have to try and revert to something, a dreadful word, but approaching normality in the economy.
And I think normality is going to be it's going to be a different normal. I know that's an overly used phrase, but I think that's a reality. Nobody's asking him to extend furlough forever, of course. What we're asking him to do is to look at the need that's there and do what he said that he was going to do, which was to do what was needed, and there plainly is still. But I think in terms of universal credit, that's a whole different story. It just doesn't make sense to say that was needed, which it was, but that it's somehow not needed now. I don't think that's a reality that households across Scotland would recognise.
Gillian Mackay, what's your take on the economy, first of all, with regard to coronavirus?
I think the easing of restrictions, whatever form they take next week, will be welcome in many places. For those who've been on furlough, particularly minimum wage jobs, 80% of a minimum wage job is not a lot of money. And even though we are seeing sectors of the economy reopen, and Murdo's saying he's seen job adverts, we need to make sure that these aren't exploitative, that people can live on these wages, that they have good terms and conditions, and they have good hours. We have to make sure that we build a society post-pandemic that values work, values workers, and are in green and sustainable industries, to make sure that we have these industries for many years to come. For young people and people on insecure contracts and things, what work looks like post-pandemic is really important, especially as things like eviction bans and stuff like that come to an end, as people may find themselves in debt and in a situation that is far from ideal, purely because of what they're being paid.
Thanks for that, Willie. Rennie, you were keen to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think Gillian's right about making sure that the jobs that we're creating for the future are well-paid, well-skilled jobs that are sustainable for the longer term and people can afford to live in them. The reality is now is that because of the shortage of workers, wages are going up. I mean, Amazon just recently put their wages up. The real issue,
your favourite company, Willie, your favourite company.
I know, exactly, and that's not necessarily replicated, but it does show that the fact that employers are demanding more from their employers and are getting paid more now. I want government to make sure that that happens. But the real challenge we've got just now is getting enough skilled workers in the right places for the companies to grow and meet the new demands of the economy. That's the big challenge for government. And that's why the training programs are incredibly important that we get them right. Because if we don't get them right, we're going to be missing out on big economic opportunities, but also we're going to see many companies just not succeeding.
Kirsten, were you wanting to come in? Yeah. Very briefly, if you would, I want to move on.
Yeah, just reflecting on what Willie said, I think that actually we do need to think about this. What is the future of work going to look like? And we shouldn't just let it happen to us. It can't just happen by mistake. We can't just find ourselves in a situation where some kind of new normal has happened by osmosis. So I think that there really is a role for all of us there to use whatever influence we can to try and make sure that the future of work is one that is appropriate, that does have all of the structures and safeguards, as well as obvious things like suitable pay.
Many thanks. Let's shift back to the health aspects of coronavirus. Alistair, we had contention this week about the business of targets. We had contention about pressure on A&E. We had contention about who should be receiving the vaccine. Bring us up to speed with some of that, if you would.
Yeah, so one of the major rows at the start of the week that kind of went into the Tuesday briefing as well was this kind of vaccine target that the Scottish Government had to vaccinate all people in the 40 to 49 age group by Monday just past, that Monday just there. And essentially, it turned into a bit of a political row, to be honest, but I think the figures were something like there's about 90% of people had their first dose and something like 75% of people had their second dose. So there's that gap between first and second dose. And I think Nicola Sturgeon, when she kind of made this target in Parliament, had said that by that date, everyone would have been given the vaccine. But when she was kind of challenged in this, I think it was on Good Morning Scotland, actually, or
it was.
Certainly the BBC, she essentially said that you can't, because the vaccine program is voluntary, you can't force people to get it. So what that actually meant was that people would be offered the vaccine by this time. I think there was still a question remaining about that gap between the first and second doses, because obviously those people that had come forward for their first dose are not reluctant to get the vaccine. They're quite happy to get it. But for whatever reason, they haven't turned up for that second appointment, or they haven't gone into drop-in centres. But I think Jason Leach on Tuesday was saying he's not particularly worried about that gap, and that it will soon kind of catch up in the coming days.
Thanks for that. Mother Fraser, Nicola Sturgeon said that she was assuming a level of intelligence when she set out the figures, and she was assuming that people would understand that there was no way 100% would take the vaccine, and she was basically saying that your party were at it.
Well, I think people looked at that. I thought it was a rather condescending and patronising view from the First Minister. She might now regret using the language she did some weeks ago, but that doesn't excuse her from the failings of the government to deliver on its promise that everybody in that age group, 40 to 49, would get the vaccine by the 26th of July. And I mean, Alistair makes a very fair point. I mean, it's very curious why this has happened, because if the First Minister is right and all these people have been offered their second dose, given they've had their first dose, these are not, refusers, they're not anti-vaxxers. What's going wrong that this big chunk of folk are not turning up for their second dose? And you've got to think there must be some failure in the system somewhere that is not happening. And it matters because, vaccination is really important here. We know the vaccination program is the route to relaxing restrictions, getting the economy going again, getting schools back, getting the NHS back to operating with some degree of normality. So there needs to be a real push on vaccination.
Thanks for that. Kirsten, enlighten us as to what's going on.
I'm listening to Murdo with one of my eyebrows slightly raised. I think he's been a wee bit disingenuous there. I think that what the FM said was perfectly clear. I think that what she's said subsequently is perfectly clear, and that the vaccination program.
Except that they were different. She said you'd get the vaccine, and then she said what she meant really was offered the vaccine. I understand these things are difficult, but she did not say what she later said. She said.
I think everybody knew exactly what she was talking about, actually. And I think that in terms of the vaccination programme, this does really matter, because this is not really what the focus of our discussion should be. The focus of our discussion should be on making sure that everybody gets the vaccinations that we all want them to have.
Where's the gap? What about Murdo Fraser's? What about Murdo Fraser's second point is that this gap between 90 odd % getting the first and 75 the second? Is it just that the letters haven't gone out? What's going wrong?
Well, I would go back to what Jason Leach said. He has said that, this is not something that is causing him particular concern, that there are measures in place to make sure that people do have the opportunity to take them up. And of course, we need to make sure that we keep encouraging people to do that. But there can be any number of reasons why somebody might not have been able to attend a scheduled session. What we need to do, though, and this I think is something that all of us do need to do, and everybody I think is doing, is to encourage people to make sure that they do come forward. It's been made really easy. There are so many different ways that you can make sure you access that second vaccination, and we need to do that because that's what makes sure that people are as protected as possible. But I think people do know that, so I'm confident that they will continue to come forward, and I'm confident that they know what messages the First Minister and the government.
That's the thing that matters. Willie Rennie, your party also was reckoning the test and protect targets had been, massaged a bit.
Yes, I think that, however, there is a wider issue here. Nicola got herself in a bit of a tangle, in fact, by a standard that she created herself earlier on this year. You might recall when the UK government were vaccinating, and they were vaccinating at a faster rate, and they were claiming that everything had been done in this certain category, and she just said at that point they'd just been offered rather than given. Now she's using the same standard, but she's got tripped up on that very issue. But no, I think we're moving on to a much more significant issue here. We're moving from potentially the vaccine just being voluntary to elements of compulsion being used. And that's where we're very nervous about the increasing talk of the vaccine certificates or passports. For international travel, it's fine. But for increasing numbers of services here, there is more talk about using it. And the language has changed. It's moved from encouragement to a requirement that's been developed. Now, I don't think we're there yet, but I don't like the way the rhetoric is going. And I hope that both governments pull back from that, because as soon as we get to the stage of people being required to have medical treatment to access daily services, which is not being talked about yet, but we're moving in that direction, I think we'll get to a stage where people will start resisting and rejecting that vaccine for that very reason. Now, thankfully, we're not there yet.
And to be fair, I've heard ministers say they're very sceptical about that approach. Gillian, hold on a second. I'm going to bring in Kirsten Oswald on that very point. Is there any way in which you think the vaccines become quasi-compulsory with a passport or a certificate system?
I think that it's really difficult to work your way through all of that in a straightforward way. That there's an awful lot there, and I think Willie's right about the need to give that very careful consideration, because there may be people who are not able to take the vaccination for whatever perfectly valid reason. There are obviously challenges in terms of different people being able or not able, as it may be, to access different services and so on. So I think that would be something that would have to be talked through and thought through extremely carefully to make sure that it didn't prohibit people or inhibit them from doing what they need to do. So yeah, as I said earlier, none of this is straightforward.
Gillian, and then finally on this section, Murdo, Gillian Mackay.
We need to ensure that people are turning up for their vaccines. The 40 to 49 age group, a lot of them could be parents. We're in the middle of the school holidays. Being able to get away somewhere with their children when they haven't been able to for 18 months could be quite a factor in this group not going to get their second dose. For young people, it's the location of some of the vaccine centres, and I appreciate some of the buses and things that are being rolled out. But I'm slightly cautious about throwing all of the mitigations out the window next week when the young people that we asked to be sensible and protect the more vulnerable and the older people are still only partially vaccinated. And what essentially we could be in danger of doing is putting them at risk by opening everything up because the majority of people have been vaccinated. I have a younger sister and a younger brother who are currently having to make decisions about where they're going and when, because they don't want to be put at risk by other people who have had both doses but are still perfectly capable of passing the vaccine on. These young people are often working in retail and hospitality and all the areas that we are continuing to advocate opening up. I think we need to continue to encourage everybody to make sure that you're taking the mitigation measures that you can, that you're getting your vaccine, to make sure that we don't end up with
masks and distancing and all that sort of stuff.
To make sure we don't end up with an accidental mutation or end up importing a mutation that puts us back to square one.
Murdo, you were keen to come in.
Yeah, just to add a couple of words on the issue of vaccine passports that both Willie and Kirsten mentioned. I mean, I agree we need to be cautious here, absolutely. I would not want to see them made compulsory on a broad basis. But I think, if we're looking at, for example, opening up, and we're seeing companies taking decisions themselves, for example, in the travel industry, though they will require proof of vaccination. I think we're going to open up things like concerts and events and nightclubs. I think, there is a role to say people have to prove vaccination or negative tests. And that's
turning it around. That's saying that these organizations require the reassurance of some form of certification.
But that might help, because we know there is a problem getting the younger age group to get vaccinated. And it may be that would be a push factor in encouraging younger people to get the vaccine if they know they have to get vaccinations in order to access the sort of services like travel, like concerts.
Very briefly, Willie Rennie, and you're smiling, but I don't think you're smiling supportively.
No, see when Murdo says push, I hear compulsion, and I think it just changes the nature of the debate. I think we should stick with encouragement for people to see the benefits. As soon as the state requires, then I think we're in problems.
Thank you all for that. An excellent discussion. We managed to cover a good range of topics. Let's move to another one, a really grim subject for Scotland. I'm going to ask Alistair to bring us up to speed. We get the latest figures on drugs deaths for the year gone by, due to be published tomorrow. No, I don't know the figures. So I'm not going to pretend I know the figure. But the figure last year for 2019 was 1,200 people in Scotland dying of drug misuse, a record total following on previous records. Alistair, it hasn't looked great for a few years, has it? Bring us up to speed with that.
No, it hasn't. No, like you said, I think last year's total was 1,264 people who had died in Scotland of drug misuse. That was the figures for 2019, released last year. So that's more than double the number of deaths in 2014, for example. It's the worst rate in Europe. It's more than 3 times the rate for England and Wales. So tomorrow we're expecting the publication of the figures for 2020. There have been reports that the figures we could see a rise in drug deaths, but those are just reports. We don't know what the figures are. Certainly, I think Hamza Yusuf, just before we started this podcast, actually was saying that he expects a challenging set of drug death figures.
Okay, and the word challenging in government terms is not a good one. It's particular narcotics that are involved, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I think just one important thing to note as well, actually, is that obviously the figures that were released last year were delayed until December. And following their release, there was kind of a lot of moves by the Scottish Government to show that they were doing something about it. So Joe Fitzpatrick, the Public Health Minister, lost his job. Nicola Sturgeon appointed a kind of dedicated drugs minister, and Angela Constance. There was extra funding of £250 million over the next 5 years announced in January. And because this year's figures are for 2020, we don't quite know whether any of that will have made an impact on the figures that will be released tomorrow. So it's worth kind of bearing that in mind, I think.
Alistair, hold on to join us in a second. Gillian, we could talk about numbers forever, but let's try and talk about solutions. What could possibly be done to get down, the worst rates in Europe, the worst in the UK?
So I was really pleased just before summer recess that I got an amendment through on safe consumption rooms. These would help to ensure that people people who are using drugs have support there should they take an overdose. There are people there that can help. We also need to look at how we deal with drugs in general.
Forgive me, are safe consumption rooms feasible in Scotland? Are they not barred by UK law?
We can see what we managed to bring forward with the Scottish Government. I'm looking forward to very much working with Angela Constance and others on seeing how we can bring these forward within the laws we have to operate within. The stopping it being a criminal justice issue is really important. This is a health
basically, yeah.
It's a public health issue. So taking that out of the criminal sphere, I absolutely recognise that the Conservatives want that right to rehab, but rehab isn't right for residential rehab isn't right for everybody. There has to be that mix there. We need to tackle unplanned discharges from drug interventions, because those periods are when people are at particularly high risk of overdose. We need to make sure that there's wraparound support with mental health support, with housing support, with all those other things that ensure that we treat the person as a whole, and we don't ask for abstinence in response, always in response to the sort of care and support they need to make sure that we get the best outcomes.
Hold those thoughts. Martin Fraser, your party got a name check there. What's your take on this? You've got a particular proposal, don't you?
Sure. So we're proposing a right to recovery bill, and this is something that's backed by a wide range of experts in the field. And essentially what that would do is give everyone who is a drug user the right to access rehabilitation treatment. It wouldn't necessarily be residential rehab, as Gillian mentioned. It might be facilities in the community. And the reason this is important is we have seen a dramatic reduction in the number of rehabilitation places made available over the last decade. And we know, and our experts confirm this, that intensive rehabilitation is the way for people to break the drugs habit. Now, the irony here is we have some excellent facilities in Scotland, world-leading facilities in Scotland, like Castlecraig in the Borders, where if you go and visit them, nearly all their clients are either from other parts of the UK or even from other parts of Europe. And yet they have very few from within Scotland because funding has been cut for rehabilitation.
What about safe consumption rooms? Would you accept that? Would you be in favour of that? It seems to run counter to UK law on the availability of drugs, which remains reserved to Westminster.
Well, with respect, I think that's a bit of a side issue, if I'm honest, because if you look and compare Scotland's drugs problem to other parts of the UK that have exactly the same laws around safe consumption rooms, they don't have the issues we do. So I think that's a very small part of a much broader, much more complex picture. And where the focus needs to be is getting funding and support into drugs rehab.
Willie, Renee, and then Kirsten. Willie, please.
I want to say the elements of what Murdo and Gillian have said are right. I think the overall approach from Gillian is the right one. The right to rehabilitation should be enshrined as well. The problem is we just don't have sufficient capacity in the system for everybody able to exercise that power. And if that law was to be able to force a change in the system, that might help. We certainly haven't got sufficient support for everyone that needs it. But we also need the Portuguese system of commissions. We would call it family and drug commissions, which would, rather than sending people to jail, you would actually have effectively compulsory treatment and support. But again, you're going back to the same problem that we don't have sufficient support within the community, whether it's residential or otherwise, for people to be able to be treated. We also think
do you do that, Willie, even if individuals have committed crimes to feed their habit?
Well, it depends. You've got to you will have to separate off if they've committed other crimes. But of course, what we don't want people as a result of their drug use to be ending up in prison, when actually solving the root problem would actually stop the crime in itself. But the final thing, we do need safe consumption rooms. It isn't the whole answer. The whole debate shouldn't be focused around just that. But I hope that because Scotland has a uniquely difficult problem here, that the UK government would listen to even actually just having some kind of pilot operation in Scotland to be able to test this out. It would be the sensible way to proceed. If it doesn't work, then of course we can go back. But I suspect it may help us deal with some of the problems that we've got here, because these problems have been embedded for years now.
Yes, they have.
Years and years and years, and the government really needs to catch up on this. They were crazy at the start. Sorry, carry on.
Would your party decriminalise drug use altogether? Pretty well.
Effectively, that's what the Portuguese system is a decriminalisation.
Kirsten, what do you make of the ideas you've heard so far?
I think it's really interesting, actually, that if we listen to what has been said by all of the contributors, there is actually quite a lot of common ground there. And I think that that's because everybody recognises the gravity of this situation and what a long-standing and complex issue it is, but it's one that needs to be dealt with. So, it won't be a straightforward fix. If it was a straightforward fix, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It needs to take in a lot of the elements that people have already highlighted. And to be fair, these are the things which Nicola Sturgeon and Angela Constance are talking about in terms of how we do move forward. So we need
why is it so? Anybody got an idea? Kirsten first. Why is it so bad in Scotland? Why are we the worst in Europe? Kirsten first, and anybody else that wants to pile in.
I suspect it's a long historic issue that has tendrils that weave their way into all different elements of society. And I think that anybody who suggests that there is one simple reason for this, or that it's something that has just happened, it is simply wrong. And I think that would be important to recognise the complexity and the very long-standing nature of this if we're going to try and make a difference, because if we don't get that, then it's going to be much more challenging to try and improve the situation, and we really need to improve the situation.
That's to some extent in the older age groups, which could indicate the very point you're making there, that it is a problem that's entrenched back decades, and you're seeing consequences. Gillian, you got a hand raised, yeah.
I think some of this is grounded in the sort of nation's mental health as well. If you look at the root causes of a lot of problem drug use, there's a lot of complex trauma at the heart of it. And actually investing in mental health services is something that we really need to do to address the root cause of problem drug and alcohol use before, as well as dealing with the actual substance abuse in itself. And some of it does have roots in sort of some of the deindustrialization of some of our communities and things like that. But I do agree with Kirsten, there's probably you
have deindustrialization in parts of England and elsewhere, and it's not as bad as it is in Scotland. Willie, you were trying to come in and then Murdo.
I was slightly disappointed that Kirsten says it is a complex problem, but I would have expected some kind of decent analysis by now as to why this has happened, especially if the government's going to get on top of this. I do welcome the fact that Angela Constance is in place, but this should have been recognised some years ago. I think there was a queasiness by Nicola Sturgeon, if I could put it that way, back in about 2014-15. I remember debating with her at that point the whole drugs issue. And to be frank, she was reluctant to do any kind of radical reform in this area along the lines that you were talking about. And I don't quite know why that was, whether it was public opinion that wasn't in a right position at that stage. But Gillian's right, there are deep-rooted social and mental health problems in their communities that's compounded this. There is a lack of self-worth. There is a combination of older, longer-term drug users who is now basically catching up with them, but also younger people who don't feel part of society and don't feel as if they're contributing and are trying new and experimental drugs. So there's a cultural thing as well, with certain communities engaging this more than others. But at the heart of it, in terms of the response from government, the government cut the funds at the time the drug deaths were going up. And that was a fundamental mistake a few years ago, and that should never have happened. It took a long time for the government to catch up. And I think at the root of that was queasiness from the leadership within the government, and that really should have been acknowledged a few years ago, and perhaps we might not be in as bad a position as we are now if that had been recognised.
Bring in Murdo in a moment if you can be patient. Kirsten, on that point, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon did say during, I think it was an election debate, what was it, we took our eye off the ball with regard to this question.
I think that all of the people who have been directly affected by this probably deserve politicians to be thoughtful and a bit frank about these things. And I do think that that's how Nicola Sturgeon has spoken about these issues. These are really, individual tragedies. There's no other way of looking at this. So when we're talking about it, then we need to do that in a responsible way. I think that's what she did. And when we're thinking about how we try and improve the situation, which is obviously really important, I think that, that the steps that are being taken are important, and they are the right ones. The funding that's in place, the minister that's been put in place specifically to look at this, because it warrants that, doesn't it? A situation of this kind
of. Well, you're suggesting you're coming rather late to the game in terms of action, in terms of funding, in terms of endeavour and effort.
I mean, I hear what Willie Rennie's saying, and I heard what the First Minister said as well. I think that we do acknowledge that this is a challenge, and it's been a challenge. So I'm not sure that anybody is doing anything really other than trying to work out how we try and make sure that we do tackle this. And I think that public health approach, where you're looking at the round, at the big picture, is the right one. If you think about how knife crime in Glasgow was tackled with that kind of approach, and the way that made a sustainable difference, I think that that's what we need to see in terms of drugs. And it will take all of the funding, all of the resources, and all of the thinking, but these are now there. And we need to make sure to do everything we can to try and make that difference going forward.
Murdo.
Yeah, I mean, I think Willie's analysis is largely correct on all this. I mean, it's absolutely right. Some of the people, sadly, dying now are in their 50s. I've had long-term users, but by no means all. A lot of younger people who have come into being drug users more recently are part of the mix too. I mean, I'll go back to the recovery point. Rehabilitation works. Rehabilitation is expensive. Residential rehabilitation is very expensive. And, you can look back at the cuts that were made in the funding for rehabilitation projects, and particularly residential rehabilitation projects. And you can see when, money's tight and there's demand for money to be spent in other areas, that's an area that gets cut back. But we are living now with the consequences of the choices that were made in the past 10 years. And that's why putting more money into the system and providing a right to recover, I think, is so important, because that's the only way we're going to reduce this dreadful death toll that we're currently seeing.
Thanks for that. I've got hands raised. I'm going to take Willie first and then Kirsten.
Murdo, do you think the Home Office would be open to doing some kind of pilot arrangement on the safe consumption rooms? Because, I mean, even on a limited basis, perhaps just in Glasgow, to try it out. Do you think there's any appetite in the UK government for doing? I accept what you say, it's not the whole point, but do you think actually to move the debate on to talk about the other issues, do you think the Home Office might be agreeable to do something?
Murdo, what's your take?
Well, I can't speak for the Home Office on that. Of course, the prosecution of crimes in Scotland is a matter for the Lord Advocate and the Crown Office. So, it would be up to the Lord Advocate and the Crown Office to decide whether or not, to what extent, they were to prosecute individuals who were going down the route of safe consumption rooms. So maybe that's a matter that could be looked at within Scotland.
Thanks for that. Kirsten, you had a hand raised as well, please.
I did, and Willie kind of stole my thunder there, but I'm grateful for that in a way, because maybe I can go back to Murdo and just in a ask in a straightforward way. Do you support the principle of safe consumption rooms as part of that suite of things that need to happen to help people and to save their lives? Is that something
to explain, Kirsten, before I put that to Murdo? Safe consumption rooms, it wouldn't just be a place to take drugs. It would be accompanied by efforts to rehabilitate and encourage and perhaps prompt a recovery and abstinence.
And to answer that directly, Kirsten,
yes, please, Murdo, go for it.
We need to see the evidence that says this would work and why it's required in Scotland, when we see a much higher rate of deaths in Scotland compared to other parts of the UK, where exactly the same legislative framework applies.
Is that not an argument to try this approach? If we all acknowledge, as we do, that this is a particular problem, surely we should be open to trying this as a solution. I think there's quite a lot of evidence out there.
If you're going to, I'm going to bring in Gillian, but Kirsten, if you're going to pilot something, you have to judge by which find a way to judge about whether it's been a success or a failure, what would be your parameters for judging success or failure on a pilot of this sort?
Well, I think that we have the unfortunate situation of people losing their lives. That's, I think, that's the fundamental in all this.
Okay, Gillian Mackay, you were keen to come in.
That was the point I was about to make. This is fundamentally about saving and enhancing lives, and that should be at the heart of whatever we do. And arguments about where the initiative should come from, whether we ask the Home Office or whether we ask the Lord Advocate not to prosecute under this. I think what we have to do and what we have a responsibility as a parliament is to ensure that we protect lives as a public health issue. Yeah. And I really hope that that's something that everybody will get on board with the safe consumption rooms. And I absolutely agree that it's not the sole part of it. It is part of ensuring that we save lives.
I'm going to bring in Kirsten in a second, but Alistair Grant, we've talked to now about consumption, but of course it's also about supply and distribution. Presumably there are efforts being made by the police authorities and others to try and clamp down on the distribution and the availability of drugs.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, certainly last year, and probably we should expect this year as well, was benzodiazepines, kind of known as benzos. And street Valium and the supply of that in the streets. And I think what happens in quite a lot of the deaths, you have this kind of polydrug use where people are using kind of multiple substances, and that contributes to the problem in a way. So I think stuff like that, cutting down in supply, and a lot of these medications will be available online for people if you know where to go and you know where to look. And we don't
relatively inexpensive, I would imagine as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about the prices, but it's certainly easily available in cities. And I think Dundee has a particular problem with drug use, as we've seen in the figures in the past. Mm-hmm. So yeah, these kind of supply issues, I certainly think it's obviously a controversial point, but I certainly think decriminalisation and looking at what other countries have done, countries like Portugal, is certainly something that should be looked at seriously. So if we're talking about a public health approach, then that is kind of the definition of that, to stop kind of criminalising people for personal possession of drugs, and to kind of point them to kind of health measures instead. And I think it's worth noting as well that I can't remember the name of the guy, but there's a senior Police Scotland figure, I think, last year was basically suggesting that criminalising people in this way just pushes them into areas where they're coming across kind of more harm, essentially. It's doing them more harm than good.
Yeah. Kirsten Oswald, you had a hand raised?
Yeah, and actually what Alistair said, I think, fits in really well to where I was going to go with that, just in terms of making sure that we don't make matters worse for people rather than better. So it is about making sure that from all the different angles that we're taking the right action, whether that is by looking at things in terms of the criminal justice system or looking at the public health element.
Murdo.
I just think we have to be a little careful about decriminalising. I think that there's a danger of the message that sends out to people about taking drugs. If you move from a criminalised substance to one that is decriminalised, do people take that as a nod from the state that somehow this is something that is safe to take? And it worries me when I meet young people, particularly school-age young people who take cannabis, who think it's a harmless drug, and it's not. And you see the impact of long-term cannabis use on older people and the mental health issues that causes. I think we need to tread very carefully on this route.
Will Irani tread carefully on decriminalisation?
Yes, absolutely. We should tread carefully, but we should look for responsible change that's been delivered in other countries like Portugal, where it's had an effect. And the effect is that more people have come forward for treatment, and more families have recovered, and more families are in a much better position than they were before. That's the sensible way to proceed. I think the more that we move it from the emotion and into the practice, I think we've got a better chance of dealing with this.
But you take Murdo's point that the word decriminalisation could easily become legalisation. These are legal. These are almost endorsed by the state if it's not presented properly.
Yeah, which is why I never used the word.
No, indeed. We're coming. Oh gosh, we're almost entirely out of time. I'm going to ask for a final word from each of our political panel on this. What would you like to see done? What could Scotland collectively do? Kirsten Oswald first, please.
I think that making sure that public health focus is at the centre of everything that we do, in terms of policy, in terms of narrative, and to bring as many agencies and people on the ground, organisations on the ground on board is the best thing we can do to try and make that change that we really need to see.
Thank you for that. Murdo Fraser, please.
Very simply, a right to recovery and a right of access for rehabilitation services.
The bill your party is promoting. Gillian Mackay, please, from the Greens.
I think ensuring that there is wraparound person-centred care in this sense, to ensure that people have the ability to recover when they want to and to thrive in the life after problem drug use.
Thanks very much. Willie Rennie.
Implement international best practice and increase capacity of rehabilitation. Make things happen rather than just endless debate.
Well, there's been an excellent debate today on this podcast. May I thank the political participants. May I thank Alistair Grant, my colleague from the Herald. Thanks very much to all of you for listening in whatever format you did. Many thanks indeed from me, Brian Taylor. Toodaloo the New.